All right, what's up, Dragon Brood? We are going to take a look at the top 10 sleepers. Cards that probably can be good, but maybe they're being overlooked now, and ideas and maybe places we could use them. I don't know. We're going to we're going to speculate on some things. Cards that are maybe underappreciated right now that do have some potential in the upcoming standard format. So let's go take a look at what sleepers we have from Streets of New Capenna. If you're looking for quality binders, sleeves, dice, deck boxes, or other supplies, be sure to check out Ultra Pro's Smoke Gray collection this month over at shop.ultrapro.com/PowrDragn and use promo code PowrDragn to save 5%. All right, we're going to start off by the way, before we get too deep, understand that this list is not put together in any particular order, so this isn't like 10 to 1 or 1 to 10. These are just 10 cards that we can talk about. So, we're going to start with Qasa Auger of Agnes. It's a colorless blue, a black, and a white for a 3/4 creature that whenever you draw a card, target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Now, I think the obvious thing on this card is that if the whole connive thing ends up being a real deck, then this card ends up being a superstar. Because obviously, if you can attack, connive, whatever, for, who knows, maybe in one turn you connive as many as 5 cards. Like, that's pretty devastating, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be in that. I mean, really, think about it. Like, there's cards that whenever you deal damage to your opponent, you get to draw a card. Whenever you bounce a thing, draw a card, right? So this could just be played in some deck that has a bunch of good value cards that just have a cantrip attached to them. And then every spell basically says, drain your opponent for 1 life. And it's not like this is the worst creature. It's a 3/4, so it is a reasonable body in the world of the current standard and can still block a lot of stuff and maybe even attack through some things. Now, obviously, you would want to play alongside more of the connive things because those are just free card drawings, but I don't think this is bad even on its own with other stuff. And that's not to say this doesn't even have use in older formats or even in Commander. I think there's so many cards that draw multiple cards that this could actually be very powerful. I mean, even something as simple as Behold the Multiverse draws 2, so that's draw 2, drain your opponent for 2, like that is even strong, right? And we already like that other card. So it's not like we have to go looking for a bunch of cards that actually have draw a card on them. They just do. So yeah, Qasa, I think, actually has some room to be better than we're giving it credit for, and it's only an uncommon, which makes it even better. Next up, we've got Shakedown Heavy, 2 colorless and a black for a 6/4 Ogre Warrior with Menace. Whenever Shakedown Heavy attacks, defending player may have you draw a card. If they do, you untap Shakedown Heavy and remove it from combat. So yeah, this card, like, it's interesting, right? Because it's got a pretty significant drawback in the fact that you don't potentially ever get to deal damage with it. That being said, if the opponent's constantly giving you cards, do you really care? You know what I mean? And look at it this way. My first thought was this should be going into aggro decks, right? Because you either get to deal 6 or you get a card and that card can give you sustainability post sweeper or whatever. But then I started thinking about the fact of, like, can this just go into some mid-rangey decks, right? Like, maybe this is one of the things that Orzhov mid-range plays. And it's just like, okay, your opponent either has to deal with it because it's a big 6/4 thing they can't attack through. If you attack with it, they're not going to want to take 6, so they're either chump blocking or giving you a card, and the mid-range decks love having that extra card value. So my first thought really was putting this into an aggro deck, but the more I thought about it, I said, well, what if more decks can actually play this card? Now, I'm not saying they will, but if a build or two comes up where this is actually playable, this is a real card, and it has Menace, so it's not even like they could just easily block it. They have to dedicate 2 things to blocking this. So yeah, I'm kind of into it. Now, does it go into the mono black aggro decks? I don't really know if that's where this wants to live, but it might. It might. I mean, it's still a significant creature regardless. Now, if you have something that gives you some benefit for drawing cards, hint, hint, we just saw a card that lets you drain your opponent every time you draw a card. So maybe these are played in the same deck. I don't know, but it's at least something we should talk about. All right, next up, we've got Getaway Car. 3 colorless for a 4/3 vehicle. It has haste. Whenever Getaway Car attacks or blocks, return up to 1 target creature that crewed it this turn to its owner's hand. And it only has a crew of 1. So the first thing I like about this is it does potentially fit in several different builds, right? It's a 3 mana, 4/3, so it's a sizable body. You can crew for 1, which means pretty much every creature, realistically, Because I was thinking like maybe just the 03, I guess small egg is like the only thing that anybody's playing. And maybe the crab. Anyway, pretty much every creature people are playing in standard right now can crew this thing. And it has haste, so it can do the thing it wants to do the turn it comes out. Also meaning you could just bounce any value creature over and over, right? You have a creature that comes into play and draws a card, awesome. Something that, destroys an enchantment or artifact when it comes into play, go for it. There's so many things you could do with this. And it works when it attacks or blocks. That's the other thing. So this could just be constant, like the Spirited Companion. Just draw a card every time it comes into play. Like you could literally just get a card every turn, crewing the Getaway Car. Like that doesn't seem like a lot, but maybe. But there's a lot of random other creatures too that, now we're going to come into play, generate a treasure. Come into play, put a +1/+1 on something. Right? All those things could be relevant here. Or even better, if they're one of the ones that make tokens, because then you get to bounce a thing attacking with this, and you get to make another body each turn. Like that could be really good too. Now, how does that work if you have multiple getaway cards in play? It could get kind of out of control. Who knows? But I think this actually has home in a few different builds. So this is what I'm definitely going to look at to put into something, even if I don't know what yet. Forge Boss. 2 colorless, black-red, 3/4, human warrior. Whenever you sacrifice one or more other creatures, Forge Boss deals 2 damage to each opponent. This ability triggers only once each turn. Now, okay, first off, before we say anything else about the Forge Boss, let's appreciate this sweet-ass vest that Forge Boss has on. Because honestly, I like vests, I just look terrible in them, so I can appreciate what's going on here. But, that being said, this card actually could be a big key to the sacrifice decks. One of the things you notice when you're playing with the Oni Cult Anvil is that sometimes you kind of want to sack a thing on your opponent's turn and on your turn, but you're only going to get the 1/1 once. Well, now, because the Forge Boss only triggers once each turn, that does mean on your turn and the opponent's turn. So if you sacrifice something now, you sacrifice something later, you get to deal the 2 extra damage. And 4 damage per turn cycle is actually pretty significant, considering all the other incremental damage those decks do. So that's like the obvious place for this. Now, is there something else? Maybe. I don't know if we're checking older formats. But if you also just play something like this in Commander and you just want redundancy for more effects that happen whenever you sacrifice things, this isn't a bad addition. It's a 3/4 body. 4 mana might probably be a little bit more than you want to spend on something like this, but for a repeatable effect with no real activation costs, this actually isn't too bad. Black Market Tycoon, a red and a green for a 2/2. At the beginning of your upkeep, Black Market Tycoon deals 2 damage to you for each treasure you control. You can tap it and create a treasure token. So yeah, I like a lot of what's going on with this card. It's a 2 mana 2/2, so whatever, it's a bear. But it has an actual really cool ability. Now people are looking at this and probably thinking, wait, this actually is just going to deal damage to me for each treasure? Like, why do I want this? Now there are some weird decks in other formats where when you take damage, things happen, and maybe this goes into something like that. But for more obvious uses, you could just have a build where you're just using the treasure all the time. Right? You can just have an extra ramp creature every turn. Like, that doesn't suck. And then we have other cards that, when treasure come into play, things happen. Or, in one case, turn your treasure into a creature. You just get to do that every turn. So this actually works with several cards out of the set. I kind of dig that a lot. Now, is a cat rogue. Likely more matters that it's a cat than a rogue, because most of the rogues are black and blue. So this doesn't necessarily fit into either of those builds very well. But maybe some cat decks want this. But like I said, you're not likely going to take the 2 damage if you don't want to, because you can always just crack your treasure. And there's really no downside. You just get mana you're not going to be able to use. And that's okay. But what if you could just use that mana every turn for something? And it could literally be anything. Anything with activated abilities, anything where stuff comes into play, stuff happens, or when an artifact goes to the graveyard. Like, I'm sure there's something here we're not seeing immediately, but this seems like a very tricky, very small card that could do some really powerful stuff. Alright, Halo Fountain. It's a 2 colorless, 1 white artifact for 1 white, tap it, untap tap creature you control. Create a 1/1 green and white citizen, pay 2, tap it, untap 2 tap creatures you control, draw a card, pay 5 and tap it, untap 15, you win the game. Now, let me say this. Before anybody expects me to say like, oh, what's the awesome thing we're going to do to try to win the game with the tokens? Secret, we're not. Right? If it just happens, it happens. But it's not a thing we're targeting. That's not why this card is going to be underappreciated. Truthfully, I think there's a lot of people that are going to play this card to try to get the win with all the tokens. But honestly, most of the time, you're going to win before those tokens even matter. This is just a bonus card to play in those decks that in weird board stalls or corner case situations, you could just sneak out a win. But realistically, the fact that you can just generate extra creatures or get extra cards with this is actually what I think makes it pretty good. It's very possible this will show up in some various types of mono white aggro, maybe even some mid-rangey things, anything that's making tokens, because you just get to make another creature or just draw a card. And the thing that's cool about it is you can do it with stuff that's attacking. And then because you can just use this as an instant, you untap your attackers. Now your attackers can still be blocked or whatever, but if you just want the card, you can get the card. Or if you tap your creatures for other abilities, because there's several cards in History of Magic that let you tap creatures as part of activations or whatnot, then you just get to do that and then untap them, possibly get to reuse them again, and generating you a card in the process. So I think this card actually has uses in a few different places, even though I think everybody's first thought is to say, hey, how do we win the game? How do we make 15 tokens? In the reality, it's the other two abilities that are probably going to make this card more playable. All right, Cabaret Charm. A red, a green, a white. For an instant, choose one. Cabaret Charm deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to target creature or planeswalker. Creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. Create 2/1/1 green and white citizen creature tokens. Now, I want to say, first off, people looked at a lot of the charms, or 3 of the charms, I think, and were kind of like, these are not that good. Truthfully, I think each of the charms is actually fine for the most part. I'm not really sure where all the hate comes from, so maybe I should have put just all the charms as a pile on the list. But I think this one's particularly good in the decks that want it, because you're already going to be able to just deal damage to a thing. You're probably going to have 2 to 4 creatures most of the time in any type of red, green, white deck, right? That's a very common thing, not a surprise. So you're going to get to basically pay 3 to deal realistically 3 or 4 damage to a source. Nothing wrong with that. That's passable. You would probably play this card in a lot of cases being an instant. But being able to give everything +1/+1 and trample can really change combat. Like, how many times have your opponents blocked with like just enough to kill your creatures, or even double blocking with just enough to kill your creature? Could you imagine giving everything +1/+1 and then destroying your opponent's board or whatever and just shifting the whole tide of combat? Like, that's going to happen more than once with this card. Like, we're going to have to make blocks in ways that are not beneficial to us because this card exists and it's good enough to be played. And then honestly, we've had other cards, like, what is it, the 2-mana white card or whatever that just made 2/1/1s? Like, that's actually a serviceable ability. And again, we have stuff with Populate, where every time a creature comes into play, things happen. So if that's a real deck, then Cabaret Charm has even more value. But even then, your opponent sweeps the board, you make 2/1/1s during their end step or whatever for 3 mana. Just lots of little triggers here that this is going to fire off that could be very good. I like this card. I like most of the charms. Actually, I think I like all of them. I could be wrong, but yeah, the charms I think are good. Cabaret Charm, if you're playing these colors, you're probably going to be playing at least 2 of these, if not more. Tenacious Underdog, colorless and a black for a 3/2 human warrior. It does have blitz of 2 black, pay 2 life. Blitz, whenever you cast it, you make the token, it dies, you get a card. You may cast Tenacious Underdog from your graveyard using its Blitz ability. So generally you can only use Blitz from your hand. This lets you use Blitz from your graveyard. Now, I want to say overall, this one is largely dependent on if something like a mono black or Rakdos aggro deck becomes a real big thing. If so, this is actually a pretty reasonable card. You're talking about a 3/2 creature for 2, which in and of itself isn't huge, but it's very good. But then it also has the ability to have Blitz that could allow you to attack with haste, post sweeper, who knows what, right? You just get that extra attacker you need sometimes. Nothing wrong with that. And you'll get a card for your troubles. But the fact that you can play it out of your graveyard is even better. Because now you get to play Blitz out of your graveyard, comes into play, or whatever, attacks, then it dies, you get a card, and then you could do it over again. Now, that being said, it does cost you 2 life every time, but we've also seen there's ways for black decks to gain life a bunch of incidental ways. But even then, if you're getting ahead and you're racing, especially against control decks, do you really care if you go down to 8 life, 6 life? Not really. You're probably going to feel okay doing that in a lot of cases. So I think this card has a pretty significant upside, but it's got to find a home. Once it does, then it probably takes off. If the format doesn't go a certain way, could be disappointing for this type of card. But I do dig it, even though the guy is too pretty to be a boxer or a Muay Thai fighter or whatever it is that he's doing. Right, next up is Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Colorless, red, green, white for a 5/4 cat demon. Creatures you control get +1/+0, have vigilance as long as you control 3 or more creatures. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and have trample as long as you control 6 or more creatures. Creatures you control also get +1 and have double strike as long as you control 9 or more creatures. Now, I want to say the reason this card made my list as being one of the sleepers is that I think a lot of people are sleeping on this card because they're thinking about Magic Christmas Land. They're sitting there saying, well, when am I going to have 9 tokens and get all this stuff? The reality is this card is sweet if you have just 3 or 6 tokens. You don't need all 9. If you get all 9, that's just a bonus and you win the game, right? You just locked out a cheat mode or whatever. But like, just playing it as is. Like, let's say you've built up a couple of tokens, or maybe you have a couple of creatures, and then during your opponent's instep, you make a couple of tokens because we have Cabaret Charm, right? And then you just play Mare. Well, all of a sudden, you're going to get to attack with a bunch of creatures that have +2/+0, have vigilance, and trample. Like, that's actually real. I mean, even if they're just 1/1s, those are all 3 1s at a minimum. That's assuming you have nothing else that's like a 2 or 3 or 4 power. At a minimum, you have 3 power creatures with vigilance and trample able to attack. And you're only 2 tokens away from potentially having double strike, right? This card has to be better. And it's actually a sizable body. Like, even if you have nothing else, like your opponent just meat hooked and wiped the board, like following up with a 5/4 is still no joke. Like, this card can be real. And think about this. Giving your stuff vigilance matters because stuff like the Wandering Emperor is out there and can no longer kill your stuff if it's not tapped. So that's a thing. Right, so Mare's actually not that bad. Like, I know it got a lot of heat, but again, I think too often when we look at cards, people look at like the best possible scenario for it. The truth is, if you can just get to mid-level on this, it's super fantastic. The top level is just an I win the game mode to break a stalemate for the most part. All right, and the last card on my list is Agnes, the Dragon's Lash. Colorless, Rakdos mana, red, Gruul mana. Is that how we're supposed to talk about that? Either way, it's 2 split mana and a red and a colorless. And it's a 3/3 haste via Shino Warrior. Whenever a creature you control with haste attacks, create a tapped treasure token. So this is actually a card I really, really like. Like, I've been a big proponent of haste lately, especially when you're trying to deal with all the sweepers and the spot removal or whatever. Haste creatures are super powerful. This card itself having haste is kind of awesome because you're paying 4 for a 3/3, which isn't that great, but you're getting a treasure back immediately if you attack with it. But there's also all the other good creatures with haste right now. You still have Goldspan Dragon. You've got Thundering Raiju. You've got the Werewolf, right? So those are all cards that are played right now. So this card could be very good in there. Not to mention, Commando faces Kakazan, the creature that becomes is it has haste. You've got the vampire that has haste, right? There's a bunch of things. You could build a whole deck full of haste things and then get an upside from this. Now, the question then becomes, what do we do with all that extra mana other than just play more spells, right? So we'd have to have something that possibly like drew cards or whatever so we could take advantage of this extra mana we're generating. But then again, maybe you're just playing something like Magda and Magda's just going and searching for more dragons or whatever. I don't know. But there's a lot of opportunity for a card like this. So I don't think it's super, and it only fits in a very particular deck. But if you end up building that deck, I think this is going to be a card you want. All right, that's it. I think that's 10. I wasn't even counting as I went along. I probably should have been. But either way, there should be 10 cards that are sleepers out of New Capenna. And honestly, I think they're all pretty playable, pretty fun. These are all cards I think I would have fun playing against and playing, which I also like. Because, I mean, we all want the most powerful things for our decks to do awesome stuff, but it's also fun to know that if these other cards exist in other builds, we're going to have fun playing Standard. And of course, some of these are good in other formats. Like, there's definitely a couple of those that I talked about that would be good in Commander as well. So yeah, lots of value in this set, which is very good for everything from the most casual of decks to the Commander decks to the big tournament decks. And I think that's what you want out of a set. So kudos to R&D because I think they checked a lot of boxes here. But let me know down in the comments, is there a card that you think is a sleeper? Do you not think any of the cards I think are sleepers are? Like, I'm sure that's going to generate a lot of debate, but overall, this was fun to pick this list. Also, let me know, do you want other lists? Because I'm still thinking about doing top 5 in each color. Probably do a deck on building 3 color decks because of the set. What else do I have in my notes? Just my favorite cards out of the set, because I think some people always are asking what are my favorite picks. I can do that as well. Whatever other content y'all want, let me know, because I'm in video building mode and now is the time. But remember, if you haven't, please join the channel, 99 cents, you know the drill. And Like, subscribe, share, all that wonderful stuff. It helps so very much. Remember, if you hit the notification bell, choose all notifications so you don't miss all these crazy videos I have coming. But that's all I have for you for now. We'll see you next time.